Good morning, historians. So we're on to our next unit. We just finished up the United States Constitution, where we learned about probably the most important document in the country, and that is the document that tells us how our government is going to work. It was a big deal. Now we have the Constitution, but now we need to have people to lead it, people to run it. So we're moving into early presidents. Today is our lesson is called Early Presidents Developing a Nation. And we're going to do early presidents today. There will be early presidents on Friday, so tomorrow, and then we'll have one more lesson on Monday about early presidents, and that will be our end of unit. So then we'll followed by our end of unit test. So you keep in mind that these exit tickets and everything are going to be part of your grade in Mastery Connect. So make sure you're staying focused and you're staying up to date and not falling too far behind. So the Constitution, like I said, was officially approved, and we had a brand new government for our new nation. Now they just had to find someone to lead that government, and it was decided that there would only be one president at a time. Remember in the Constitutional Convention, it was kind of argued that maybe there should be more than one president running the country at a time. Well, they did decide that it was only ever going to be one person, and this was going to be a big job for the first time. It's a big job anyway. The person that is elected to be president of the United States, it is a big job, but it is, this one was really, really big because this position was going to set the stage or set a precedent. So I set an example for every single president to follow. Every president after this first president would learn from that person's mistakes and grow on that person's achievements. The whole world was going to scrutinize this person's job. So it was a big, big job. But who was this young nation going to elect? And I think you guys all already know who it is. Let's talk about our objectives, though, and our success criteria before we get too far into our lesson. That was just kind of a review. First, you have two objectives today. You can answer questions about early presidents of the United States, and that's going to look, you're going to answer questions correctly, okay? And then you can answer questions about the president's cabinet. Now, a cabinet here is not like the cabinet where you keep your snacks in your kitchen or the cabinet where you keep your clean towels and sheets. That's not this type of cabinet. It's a different type of cabinet. So listen closely for that. You are going to be able to answer questions about both of those. And how you know you're successful is you're going to complete an exit ticket in Google Classroom answering these questions. I'm going to show you what this looks like, guys. This is your exit ticket for today. It is called Developing a New Nation. You will complete it. You can actually check your answers at the end, make any corrections if you need to. I want to show you guys, this is going to be attached separately. So like our lessons before, if you look here, I showed you this before, but I think a lot of people are just not finding it. Your video is attached in a separate assignment than the exit ticket. So our video is going to be here, and then your exit ticket's in a separate assignment. So after you watch this video, you need to come back to the classwork stream in your classroom, and then go to the exit ticket, okay? So that's how you know you're going to be successful, is if you can answer those questions correctly on that exit ticket. And then what we're going to be covering today is, first, we're going to learn about George Washington. We're going to then talk a little bit about Madison and Jefferson. And then we're going to get into the first Adams. So we have three big topics to talk about today. And starting with George Washington, we are going to talk about his presidency and some of the decisions that he made that are now the model for every president that follows. So it was not written in the Constitution to do things a certain way, and he did them, and presidents even today still do some of the things that he started with. So Washington had tried to leave the public office ever since the war. After he won the war, he said he was going to step down and he was going to go back to his home in Mount Vernon and he was going to retire. But he was called on time and time again by the American people. And being the patriot that he was, the man who loved his country, he always answered that call, even when it was a detriment to him and his health and what he really wanted to do. And he was called again, and this time it was to be the very first president of the United States. And this is the oath he took because he did accept that position. This is the oath of office. I do so solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And every single president since George Washington has taken this exact same oath, and they're very powerful words. Setting precedents, George Washington. So a precedent is kind of like an example that they're going to be making. So a precedent is something they start doing that other people are going to copy from here on out. And right now, because George Washington is the first president, almost every action he took might set a pattern for the following presidents, good or bad. So it was a lot of pressure, especially because you don't want to make any mistakes that other presidents are going to keep making after you. He wanted to set the right precedents, and by doing this, he wanted to closely follow the Constitution in carrying out his duties and protecting the freedoms of the people. He felt like that was the best way. He wasn't going to really go too far away from what the Constitution told him to do. There were some decisions, though, that he had to make that weren't written in the Constitution to help him run the country. And that happened early on in his presidency. He found out he had to make these, and they're still followed today. And the first one, and this one's going to seem very silly, but it was a heated debate in the government at the time, and it was how should you address the president? So that what that means is not like how do you write a letter to him, it's how do you what name do you call him? So like you call me Mrs. Perusich, that's how you address me. Well, a lot of people believed that he should actually be called His Highness the President, because remember, they had all been part of the British Empire and they'd had a king. But a lot of people think that it sounded too much like the way you do address a king, and that was one of the things they were leaving behind with this new government. And some wanted him to be called His Excellency. But it was finally agreed that you were to simply address the president as Mr. President. And to this very day, every president from there on out has been called Mr. President when he's being addressed. And if we were to ever get a female president, she would be called Madam President. That would be her title. Other presidents, though, were pretty more important. And these ones are still followed today, too, and have grown a little bit. In the Constitution, it was put in that there are 3 branches of government. We've talked about this. There's the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. The Constitution also said about those branches that there would be departments in the executive branch that would help, that were going to be there to help the president. So the executive branch would be kind of split up just a little bit more, with other people leading certain parts of the executive branch, so that the president could get some better advice and do his job a little bit better. But the Constitution did not say what those would be or how many there should be. So all it said is that the executive branch needed to have departments, but it didn't say it needed to have 3 or 6, and it didn't say what each of those branches should do. And this is one of the things that Washington had to come up with. Or actually Congress had to come up with the help of Washington. So what they came up with at this time was 3 executive departments. First, there's the Department of State. And this department was developed to help the president with his relations with foreign countries. So like peace treaties and trade agreements and things are all done under the Department of State, and they still are today. There's the Department of War. This department was to help the president with defending the country. Pretty self-explanatory there. and it's now called the Department of Defense today. And then there's also the Department of Treasury. And this was the department that was expected to collect taxes, pay bills, and take care of the government's money. And I always think of treasury or a treasurer as treasure is money, so it must have something to do with money. So, or treasury, the T and the tax. So the Department of Treasury is the part of the executive branch that takes care of all of the government's money. And each department has a head or like a boss of each of these departments, and they are called a secretary. And to this day, they still are. So the head of the Department of State is called the Secretary of State. So that leads us to the president's cabinet. And remember, it's not where he keeps his snacks, and it's not where he keeps his clean sheets and blankets. The president's cabinet is different. Because they split up the executive branch into those three different branches of state, war, and treasury. He needed people to lead it, and so this set up the very next president. The Constitution says that the president may get advice from his department heads, so that the secretaries. So the Constitution says that he needs to make sure that he's checking in with these leaders of the branches to help him make better decisions as a president. And at first, Washington decided he was just going to talk individually to each one of the secretaries, the heads of secretaries, but he soon realized it was a better idea for them all to meet at the same time so that they could discuss matters, discuss problems, and get advice together, and they could kind of brainstorm. Two heads are always better than one, right? So the heads of the department of each of these departments, of the Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, and the Secretary of Treasury, these became known as the president's cabinet. Those people, those are his cabinets, kind of like they're his advisors almost. And their meetings are now known as cabinet meetings. So when they would get together, they would be in what's called a cabinet meeting, and he'd be meeting with the cabinet members. So those are the secretaries of state, of war, and of treasury. This is still followed today. The president still has cabinet meetings. And it wasn't written into the Constitution to have a cabinet, but every single president since Washington has had one. And this is just a picture of a cabinet meeting that President Obama was having with his. And as you can see, it's grown. It's not just 3 members anymore. Now there's heads of all sorts of different branches of the executive department. There was another precedent that he set, and that was with the United States tax. It was an important law. So under Washington, Congress passed a law that put a tax on nearly 80 imported goods. These are products that are brought into the U.S. from other countries, so when you purchase something that's made in another country at this time, it was taxed on. And a lot of people understood that they needed to be taxed for the government to have money. So this wasn't one of those no taxation without representation things. This was they had representation in the government and people agreed to the tax. In the old days, the government never had any money and they had a huge debt to pay. And so this tax really wasn't very much, but it was just enough and they could start paying their bills for the very first time. And we still have government taxes, and that was because of the precedent started by George Washington. And now we're going to move into Hamilton and Jefferson. And they're not presidents yet because Washington is still president, but we need to talk about the start of political parties in our country. We do have political parties. There's a few of them, but you've probably heard of the 2 big ones. We have a Republican political party and a Democratic political party, Democrat. So those are 2 big parties. There's some smaller ones. Well, it all started somewhere. It actually started under George Washington's reign. So we're going to start with the solid foundation that George Washington built. The citizens of America were really happy with the new Constitution and the way things were going. Everything was running really smooth. Things were being passed. It was peaceful. And it just looked like it was going to be a really good thing. But that harmony, that peace, really didn't last very long. Differences between Washington's closest advisors started to make things a little bit unsettled. So Washington selects. So this is who he selected for some of his departments in his uh, executive branch, in his cabinet. He chose Alexander Hamilton to be the head of the Department of Treasury. And he chose Thomas Jefferson, two names you probably know, to head the Department of State. Both of these men were great patriots. They were smart, they were super intelligent, and they were probably some of the most capable people to ever serve in the government. They also disagreed with each other on almost everything. And this caused a lot of tension for George because he always felt like between his advisors, he was always being pulled in two different directions. They both had different hopes for the nation, and that was where a lot of their disagreements came from. Hamilton, he supported farming. Remember, at this time, the colonies were mostly small farms. But he really wanted to see the growth of manufacturing. He wanted the economy to grow and become big. And he wanted to be able to, what that means is he wanted to be able to take what they were growing with manufacturing and sell it to other countries. And he wanted large cities. He wanted the smaller cities to grow because he felt like large cities were going to be great for the economy. And he really liked a strong central government. And he also thought that the rich and well-born should be the ones making the decisions, so the ones that were elected to the office. It's not saying that he didn't think that the common man couldn't and that they weren't capable. It was more that he just thought that the well-born and the wealthy people had more experiences in life, and so they would be better suited to make decisions. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, agreed that we needed some manufacturing and trade, but he really wanted America to stay mostly a nation of very small farmers. And he didn't want to see the cities grow because he went over in Europe. He had actually saw what big cities bring, and sometimes big cities bring a lot of poor and a lot of hungry people, and he really didn't want that for America. And he also thought that a small central government was the best. He didn't want a very strong central government. And he thought that ordinary people were the ones that should be involved in governing themselves. They were the ones being governed, so they should have a say. So you can kind of see that these two were definitely on both ends of the scale here. And they grew a strong dislike for each other. With such different ideas of what the country should look like, it was really no wonder that these two men disliked each other so badly. And that brought upon political parties. The disagreements between the two led to the birth of these political parties in America. A group of people, and what a political party is a group of people who share beliefs about how the government should be run. And these people will join together and they elect representatives who share their beliefs. So today we have groups of Democrats that elect a Democratic official, and then we have groups of Republicans that elect a Republican official that really represent their beliefs. And in the 1790s, the Americans who liked Hamilton, they called themselves Federalists, and that was their political party. While supporters of Jefferson, they called themselves Democratic Republicans, and these have evolved to be the political parties that we see today. So, and that's pretty important, guys, because our government is very strongly influenced by political parties. And it all started there with Hamilton and Jefferson under George Washington. But that leads us to our second president, the very first Adams, and he made some pretty unpopular choices, and so we're going to talk about those. So it was time for a new president. Washington had been elected for 2 4-year terms, so he had served for 8 years. And he would have rather have retired long before this, but he stayed for the American people. But after 8 years, even though Americans would have loved for him to continue, he knew that the people needed to not depend on just one man to lead it, and it was time for another president. So, this is the very first time that they had the true contest for president. It was pretty much a done deal that George Washington was going to be president, but this time it was really the American people had a contest. There was two people that were wanting to be president of the United States, and it was a pretty close election. So, John Adams had been Washington's vice president through all of his 8 years, and he was a candidate for the Federalist Party, and he liked a strong central government. And Thomas Jefferson at the time was the candidate for the Democratic Republican Party. He wanted a smaller central government, and he was also very well known because he was the author of the Declaration of Independence, on top of many other things. John Adams won this election, but just barely. It was a very close election, and indeed, it was probably one of the closest elections in American history. And back then, the person who lost the election, he became vice president. And this kind of wasn't always a great idea because you figure you've got two people with completely different political beliefs. It was pretty hard to get anything done without some type of a pretty strong and heated debate. So let's talk about John Adams. He was very well respected, but he was not as loved as Washington. He was kind of unpopular with the Americans for a lot of reasons. And he also ended up making some decisions as president that made him even less liked by the American people, sadly. But his decisions, even though it was the unpopular decision and it resulted in the American people not liking him, it really was the right decision for the country. So it started back with a problem, and this actually started under Washington. While George Washington was president, France and Great Britain were back to fighting again. France had helped the Americans win the revolution, remember? And so France kind of thought it was time for America to step up and help them fight against Great Britain now. And most of the people that were Democratic Republicans agreed. They felt like we should take France's side and we should go help them fight their battles against the British. But some thought that America should help Great Britain, believe it or not. And these were mostly the Federalists. But Washington had decided to keep the United States neutral, or to stay out of the conflict altogether and not take a side. And because of that, the British started to seize American ships and sailors headed to France. And that made even more of an argument for those Federalists that the Democratic Republicans that wanted America to take France's side. But he really believed that the new nation needed time to grow and become stronger before they got involved in another war. So that's how he stayed. He stayed neutral throughout all of his presidency. But by the time John Adams was elected president, the French had also started seizing American ships because they weren't taking the French side. And so not only was the British taking American ships over, but so were the French. They were also threatening America. And Adams also wanted to remain neutral and not take the U.S. into another war. He agreed that it was a wrong decision to go into battles again. And he also wanted peace, though. And this isn't the way to make peace. He was going to make an enemy one way or another. So he started to send representatives to France to talk to the French officials to see and ask them to stop. But the French ended up demanding a loan, and the American people didn't have that much money to loan. And so the American representatives ended up returning back to the United States, and they were kind of angry with France. So at that time, America had started to develop a navy to help protect their ships. And this kind of made it look like another war was really going to happen. And John Adams had to make a very tough decision. Was he going to go to war with France? Was he going to go to war with Britain? Or was he going to stay neutral? And it was a very unpopular and hard choice to make. He knew that going to war and taking action to the seizing of American ships would make him very popular. People wanted him to do that. They wanted to help they either wanted to help the French or they wanted to help the British. He was going to if he made that decision, people would like him. And it's easy to, sometimes that's an easy decision to make a choice that makes people like you. But he also knew and believed with every ounce of his soul that the young nation needed to stay peaceful for now. They needed to develop their government before they moved into any type of war. And so finally, he decided to send another ambassador to France to ask them to stop again. This time, France listened and they did come to an agreement. And so this meant America was able to stay out of the war, which was the best thing after all, but it made him very unpopular. People wanted him to go to war. So he made the decisions to stay out of it, and that made him unpopular. But he also did something else. He also passed many laws that the Democratic Republicans didn't like. And that resulted in enough people not liking him at the end of his very first term as president that he didn't get reelected. He only served one term as president, whereas George Washington served two. But because he was so unpopular, he lost the next election. So here are some of the big main points you need to remember from this lesson. First, Washington was a very well-loved person, and that's why he was chosen. It was because the American loved and respected him. He was chosen because he led the Continental Army to victory, and he was respected because he stepped down from the army after the war was over, and he had been chairman of the Continental Convention. The American people loved and adored Washington, and that's why he became the first president. When he was a president, he made executive departments, and he created Congress and him created three executive departments that helped the president with his duties, and they still do today. And that's the Department of State, the Department of War, and the Department of Treasury. These department leaders are now called the Presidential Cabinet, and when they all meet, it's called a cabinet meeting. Political parties, another important thing we learned today. This started with Hamilton and Jefferson and their very different beliefs about the government, and it led to the birth of the two political parties. Federalists were Hamilton supporters, and Democratic Republicans were Jefferson supporters. And today our political parties look very similar, but they've grown quite a bit. And then we've got the unpopular John Adams as our second president of the United States. And he was liked, but he was not as loved as Washington. And he made decisions while he was president that made him even less popular with Americans. And that was when he didn't go to war when France and Great Britain were fighting and seizing American ships. And then he also passed some unpopular laws, and it resulted in him not being reelected as president. And so he only served one term as president of the United States because he was quite unpopular. So now it is your turn to complete your exit ticket. The exit ticket has questions on it about the two early presidents we talked about, political parties, and the presidential cabinet. So please go complete that exit ticket now and turn it in so I can put that in Mastery Connect. Have a great day.